good turnout today. Anxiety, depression, massive one, eh? Yeah.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, when I was talking to a couple of people here before, this is a big topic, and there are lots of different pieces to this puzzle. So as we go through, I'm going to be breaking down one section of it that I think is a really important section to look at, based on a bunch of the research and some courses that I've done in this sort of area. But there's a number of other pieces that we'll kind of break down very quickly too. Anybody who doesn't know me, I'm Jason Loken. I'm a naturopathic doctor and an osteopathic manual practitioner. I'm currently working my PhD in integrated medicine, and I work right across the corner there. I'm also downtown in Toronto, but we live 2 minutes from here, so I've gradually been moving more and more out this way over the last year. This is a very interesting topic for me because I can honestly say that the vast majority of people that I see, some degree of this almost always mixes into any other problem. So not 100%, but I definitely find I've been in practice as a naturopathic doctor for about 15 years, a little over, and I've seen it just get more and more and more. And not just in adults, but I see it more and more in kids too. So there's a number of things going on. Most of what I am going to talk about here is going to be based on the research from a foundation in Chicago called the Walsh Research Institute that focuses on mental health. And when we get to that, I'll break that down a little bit more detail and tell you what they've been finding. So we look at mental health. You're like, why can't I see anything? Okay, I've got it in two ways here. So when we look at mental health, there are several factors to this. What we're going to focus on today is something I call advanced nutrient therapy, because in my mind, if that is going on, it is a big rate-limiting step on getting better. The other parts, and I'll come back to this, the other parts I look at, I think, are self-regulation. So is anybody familiar with what self-regulation means? Or any of the research that's come out on self-regulation? So self-regulation, for the most part, what we're looking at is it is our ability to regulate our autonomic nervous system. So it is our ability to how well do we manage fight or flight, and how well do we manage rest and digest. And if we're in fight or flight, are we able to get back into rest and digest so that we can manage life with much more grace and ease? This is a huge concept that is coming up. Dr. Stuart Shanker, who's probably one of the experts in this area from York University, does a lot of work on self-regulation. He actually works a lot with kids with ADHD and autism spectrum as well. I think that this is a huge area of research now that needs much more around it. But essentially what we find is with self-regulation that when we are stuck in fight or flight, we cannot access the parts of our brain that allow us to actually make better decisions. We can't access this prefrontal cortex part of our brain that allows us to have executive functioning and to make choices that are really in our highest good and not more just habitual and emotional in nature. So there's a lot of stuff that we can do to really fine-tune and get ourselves to back into a more balanced state for our nervous system. So that's another talk all on its own. The other one I look at is mind, body, spirit. Under this, I think of this as finding people to work with around things with counseling, cognitive behavioral therapy, incorporating things like mindfulness training, yoga, meditation, all of these different pieces. And then there's different techniques that we can use, things called neuroemotional therapy or psyche, or all these different techniques to help sort of break things down and help us navigate through these mental health challenges that we might have. Also with this ties in often some aspect of spirituality and stuff too. What are our belief structures like, and how are those imposing in how we are viewing life? Are we getting stuck in the same patterns? How do we change those patterns and those habits so that we start to approach things in a new light so that we can ultimately have different outcomes? So I think this is another big piece that needs to be worked with. Gut health and nutrition. I find this absolutely fascinating. Anybody familiar with some of the research on things called gut biome or the gut health? This is blown up over the last probably 5 to 7 years, the information they have found on this. So when I talk about nutrition and gut health, this is different than advanced nutrient therapy. This is looking at diet, lifestyle, and the effects that it has on the bacteria and the different microorganisms that live in our gut. Essentially, what we know now is that there is literally a different bacteria that can decide why we might be angry. When we're angry, we actually create different bacteria. When we're anxious, we actually have different bacteria that play a role in making us feel more anxious. And if we're not so anxious, then we create an environment that's not hospitable to making more of those types of bacteria. I talked about this in our seminar that we did on fat loss through nutrition. And that's one area, because people like to know how to kind of manage weight, and bacteria is a big player in that. But what they found is that it actually is so far-reaching. And they consider it now, the gut biome, this mass amount of different bacteria that we have in our gut, they consider it just as important as another organ. So they would say, just like the liver, just like the kidneys, just like the heart, it plays just an equally important role because of its communication with the rest of the body. And when we look at things from a epigenetic standpoint, which means how we interact with our environment and how that actually changes the way that our genes express. Does that make sense? So a lot of times people think that what our genes are, we're kind of screwed, we're stuck with. So if we got bad genes, then we just have bad genes. And the reality that's really come out of this for the last, again, probably the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a lot of information on epigenetics. They've really realized that there is a very small percentage of genetics that are written in stone, maybe 5 to 7%. And these are things that are more like sickle cell anemia or Huntington's disease or some pathology that if you unfortunately have the traits for that you can't change that much. But what they've realized is that the vast majority of what goes on is all epigenetic, meaning above genetics. And what that means is that how we interact with our environment, how we manage stress, what kind of foods we eat, if we move our body, if we don't, how we react when somebody cuts us off in traffic. Like all these different things play with how we then turn on or turn off different genes from expressing. So what I find amazing about that is it puts us back in the driver's seat of our own health. We're not sort of at the disposal of our genes. We have a lot of say in how we're going to be. So in my mind, if we do any kind of genetic testing and find genetic susceptibilities, or if we know in our family that there's a history of things like depression or anxiety or breast cancer or something along those lines, then we know that we can actually influence that very powerfully through epigenetics. So the gut biome is one of the major players in that. When we go back to the nutrient therapy, this is also a huge player in epigenetics. What they found is that targeted nutrition that is required for certain people, depending on their situation, can be a very, very powerful switch for how we turn on or turn off different genes from expressing. And we're going to delve into that as we go along, and I break down kind of how it actually works and how we assess to find out if there's an imbalance. So again, all of these other pieces I think are all equally important. Why I'm starting at this one is when I was at the Walsh Research Institute doing the physician training program there, we saw patient after patient. I mean, these poor people would have to come in and there'd be a massive table of 75 different doctors there, and they'd be sitting in the front and everybody would kind of be asking questions. And we would see initial patients, and then we'd also see sometimes follow-ups from 2, 3, 4 visits later. So we were able to see the progression, not just the change in the symptoms, but the change in the blood chemistry and the urine chemistry to match the changes in the symptoms. And I tell you, it was absolutely astounding and tear-wrenching sometimes when you would see some people that were either full-blown anxiety, depression, to schizophrenic, to bipolar, to autistic, to ADHD. It's all one big sphere. And when you can figure out if there's any biochemical imbalances and you can figure out the targeted nutrition for it, it's really powerful what kind of an impact you can have. So Walsh Research Institute, and I implore you to take a look at it, Google them, and sort of read a little bit more about them because they're really doing some amazing work. Dr. Walsh is still the founder of it, and he's still working hard at researching all of this stuff, and he's treating lots of patients, and now he's training physicians all over the world in his approach to be able to assess and treat mental health. So it's a non-profit public charity, and their expertise is in autism, ADHD, depression, behavior disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, and Alzheimer's. And they run an international physician training program for doctors all over the world. He has had some of the most vast clinical experience out of any doctor out there. He's been doing this for about 40 years or so, with originally with another doctor called Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, who was a medical doctor, psychiatrist, PhD, brilliant, brilliant guy. And they did a lot of this work together, and then he carried on. So they've seen about 10,000 different patients with behavior and ADHD. They've seen 3,500 schizophrenia and bipolar patients, 3,200 depression, anxiety, 6,500 autism. They've done laboratory testing of over 30,000 mental health patients and controls, and they have had over 3 million different chemical assays that they have at their disposal to start to figure out what is going on and what are some of the correlations that we can make. And so what he's found is that over this period of time, he's found striking blood and urine chemistry differences between mental illness populations and the rest of the society. So when you actually look at very specific blood chemistry and urine chemistry, you will see very different markers when you look at people that are suffering with certain mental health issues and those that are not. And we'll break those down as far as what some of the big players are in a lot of these things. So biochemical individuality. The same reason why, when we talked about our fat loss one a couple of classes back, the same reason why you could feed two people the exact same diet and one will lose weight on it and one will gain weight on it. We are biochemically individual, and a lot of this plays in with how our genes are set up and all of the epigenetic markers that turn on or turn off different genes from expressing. But because of the genetics and epigenetics, most people are deficient in several nutrients and overloaded in others. Some people have an epigenetic susceptibility to not being able to keep certain nutrition in the body. It gets sucked out or it gets pulled out. Some people build up way too much because they don't have mechanisms to get rid of it. And we'll look at some of those things, and those are all very measurable. The good news is that when we look at all of the different nutrients that we think about, there is less than about a dozen that plays a significant role in regulating brain chemistry. And the reason that there's a few of them is because the primary factors that we're looking at are the production and the reuptake of all of these key neurotransmitters. Do people know what I'm talking about when I say neurotransmitters? Does anybody know the names of any of them? Throw out something if you know it. Serotonin? Serotonin would be an example of a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is an example of a neurotransmitter. Adrenaline or norepinephrine, that's another type of a neurotransmitter. And GABA, that's another one. These are going to be the primary ones that we're going to look at, because if there's imbalances within those, they do tend to govern a lot of how we think, feel, and act. And so when we look at some of the initial lab testing, it is to figure out what's actually going on with these neurotransmitters. So a lot of times people wonder, well, how do vitamins and minerals and amino acids and all this different nutrition, how do they actually help a person with any kind of serious mental illness? Don't you actually need powerful drugs in order to make any difference? And what's been found over the years is that nutrients are extremely powerful. And like I said, they also can work very specifically as an epigenetic medicine that upregulates or downregulates different genes from expressing. So when we're talking about mental health, we're looking at neurotransmitter synthesis. Nutrients play a key role in the production of different neurotransmitters. There's epigenetic regulation of gene expression. We can impact neurotransmitter reuptake. So when you think of neurotransmitters, I want you to think of it in two ways. We have to make enough neurotransmitters, and then once we've made enough, we have to make sure that enough stays in what's called a synapse to have an action. And the problem is that we can either not make enough of them if we don't have the right nutrients, or we can't keep enough of it here or we can't get rid of it when we need to and we have a buildup and we create way too much. Any of those things are all going to play into it. The other thing that nutrients do is they protect against oxidative stress. Has anybody heard of antioxidants? We take antioxidants to try and ward off and manage oxidative stress. So oxidative stress we get from just living in this world. Stress creates oxidative stress. Poor nutrition creates oxidative stress. Exercise, to a point, will create oxidative stress. Environmental pollution, heavy metals, pesticides, all this kind of stuff, all these things potentially create oxidative stress. If we're alive, we're creating oxidative stress. And then we need to kind of manage that so that we're not getting too much of it. So neurotransmitters, we talked about the 4 key ones: serotonin, dopamine, GABA, norepinephrine. And to give you a little just overview of kind of what they do and why they're important to look at. Like I was saying, when you look at neurotransmitters, too much or too little is a problem. They really need to try and be in the right balance for the person at the right time. And if they're out of balance, they will absolutely affect how we think, feel, and act. So we look at serotonin. Probably people are mostly familiar with serotonin. It's that natural sort of feel good. It regulates anxiety. It makes us feel a little bit happier. When people are feeling down and they have a piece of chocolate, we get a little bit of a serotonin boost. So everybody feels a little bit better for a bit until you hit the crash again after. Serotonin also plays in a cycle that eventually turns into melatonin. Melatonin is a primary neurotransmitter that we look at for governing circadian rhythm, those sleep-wake cycles. So changes in serotonin can also play a role in how we feel, and it sets up, like we talked about before, it can set up cravings and all sorts of things too. Dopamine has been given a lot of research has gone towards looking at dopamine over the last while too. So when I think of dopamine, I think of 3 major things. I think of Parkinson's. So when people have very low levels of dopamine, when they can't create it, they can get Parkinsonian symptoms, or they can get full-on Parkinson's, which is, it plays in with movement. ADHD is a big one. So a lot of the stimulant medications are designed to try and raise dopamine levels. And then addiction also plays a lot with dopamine. And it can sometimes be if the dopamine levels are too high, or if they're too low, or if you become resistant to dopamine receptors. So I think of all of those things with dopamine. So getting dopamine in the right amounts can make a big impact on how you're feeling. We think of it with addiction, working memory, attention and focus, and it plays in with pain processing too. Sometimes if people are very sensitive to pain, they might have imbalances in their dopamine levels. Same with people that have very high pain resistance. They could have maybe actually very high levels of dopamine. GABA is another one. So GABA, when we take a benzodiazepine, okay, or benzodiazepines for going to bed at night if you can't sleep, that binds into GABA receptor sites. So GABA is this, just tries to calm us right down and shut everything off. It's actually the primary one that counteracts the excitatory stimulus from glutamate and also adrenaline. So if people are running too high, too fast, adrenalized all the time, often they do well with something that's going to stimulate GABA receptors. It's a natural inhibitor, and it calms down feelings of fear and anxiety. Norepinephrine, or also think of this as adrenaline. So this is our primary stress hormone for when we're in fight or flight. And it can be a problem either way. If people have too much adrenaline, they can feel anxious and overexcited and even full-on mania. If it's too low, then you might find that your brain's a little foggy, you feel tired all the time, you might have lost your motivation, poor attention and focus. So again, having it in the right balance makes a big difference. When we look at nutrients, and we're looking at some of the ones that are often big players in this stuff that come up over and over again, these are some of the main ones that we see. And I'm going to break these down in more detail for you, but just so you can see it. We often tend to see a copper overload. So when I'm measuring blood levels, it's not uncommon to see elevated levels of copper in relationship to zinc particularly. And I'll explain this in more detail as we go through each one. Common deficiencies, B6 and zinc, very common deficiencies. I see this all the time. Pyrrol disorder is a very specific epigenetic condition that actually sucks out a ton of zinc and B6 and can leave people extremely poor ability to manage stress. And then there's these things called methylation imbalances, which I'll explain as we get to that section. And this is very much a epigenetic picture again, where it is set up from about early on in utero, and we actually are certain methylation, which is just a carbon with a few hydrogens attached to it. They're attached to different markers on proteins and DNA, and they basically turn on or turn off different genes from expressing. And so these things are actually passed along often generation to generation. And sometimes it can be several generations back that get passed along. But they are influenced through nutrition and how we interact with our environment. You also can have fatty acid imbalances and toxic metal overload. I'm not going to talk as much about those because the other ones I find come up over and over again more primary. But all of these factors powerfully impact the production and the regulation of these neurotransmitters. So let's look at depression and anxiety. So think of this as depression primarily, but anxiety would fall into here too with slightly different ratios. Why it is so difficult to treat anxiety depression with a specific medication across the board for everybody is because the etiology, the reason for having the anxiety depression could be many different ways. And if you've got a certain imbalance, a serotonin reuptake inhibitor like Paxil or something like this might be beneficial for a certain biotype, but it would be completely the opposite than what was needed for another biotype. And so medications have a place where they can be beneficial, but if you want to understand the background of why does the person have it and what imbalance do they have, and in my mind, correct the nutritional biochemical imbalance first and then see what's still left. So when we look at this, and I'll break these down, but 30% of people with depression are undermethylated, which I will explain all this as we go along to it. 20% have a folate deficiency, folic acid. This is also known as overmethylation. 17% are overloaded with copper. Or sorry, no, more than 17. No, that's right. And pyrrols, about 15% have pyrrol disorder, and then the others fall into a smaller category. So when I'm assessing, I am always looking for what's the person's methylation status? Are they under, over, or normally methylated? Do they have high copper to zinc ratios? And I have to test them to see if they have something called pyrrols, depending on the way that they present. But what I want you to get from this is that when you know somebody with anxiety or depression, you know somebody with anxiety or depression. You do not know the whole realm of what everybody with anxiety and depression deals with. They all present differently depending on what the imbalance is. So let's break down what some of the standard traits are to some of these imbalances. So when we're looking at somebody that is undermethylated, when we come to that, you'll see tendencies, they're more prone epigenetically to having symptoms like obsessive compulsive tendencies. You'll see seasonal affective disorder, so their mood will go down as soon as the sun starts to drop down a little bit more. Their personality, they're very competitive and perfectionistic people. And what's fascinating is when Dr. Walsh has done this research, so Dr. Walsh, really brilliant guy, he originally did the research he worked in the Prison Institute. And what he started to find was that he started to treat these violent criminals in the prison system. They started to get better. And what he started to notice is he started to see trends in the same biochemistry coming back over and over and over again. And he got to the point where he said that with over 90% accuracy, he could say, just show me the biochemistry and I will tell you if that is a violent criminal or a non-violent criminal based on their chemistry. And he was right over 90% of the time. And so what he started to think of was, this is crazy because all of these people were kids with horribly bad biochemistry. And if we could actually start to treat kids early on figure out what some of their epigenetic imbalances were, get them on the right path, you could alter the entire course of their trajectory for their life. And that's really powerful. I'll explain this in a little bit, but I worked with a 12-year-old a while back who was diagnosed with anxiety disorder and ADHD, and even started to actually hurt himself a little bit. So it wasn't full on, but he'd like bite himself, or he'd start to kind of make himself bleed a little bit at times too. And one of the tests we run is something looking for a urine pyrrol test, which we will talk about in just a bit. The normal values for pyrrols should be between 0 and 10. And when I ran this child's test, his came back at almost 100. Like, huge. I was thinking, I almost got teary when I read it because I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is very treatable. Like, when you see problems like that and these kids have been on a trajectory, that is going to alter. I can guarantee if we can now get on track with that and start to treat it and get them down, the impact that that would have on his chemistry is huge. I think of that child and I don't think he has ever had an idea of what it feels like to actually be calm in his body. Because his biochemistry, he has no ability to make serotonin, GABA, dopamine. It was like astounding. So we just started treatment. I will look forward to reassessing probably in about 4 to 6 months to see where his levels come down and what's changed. But when I see stuff like that, I get so excited because I'm like, oh my gosh, there is a big biochemical imbalance. Let's see what changes once we get that on track. Undermethylated, as we carry along, these are the guys that do well with serotonin reuptake inhibitor medications. So if they're undermethylated and they went on it, they'd be like, yeah, I went on that and it actually worked really well. Everybody should do it because it made a huge difference. So for them, that actually works. Now, I'm not saying you have to do that. You can treat that nutritionally and be just as effective with it. These are the people that are generally very calm exterior, but they have a lot of inner tension. They're very strong-willed, usually high libido, and they tend towards having seasonal allergies. We look at somebody that would be considered over-methylated, or has a low folate depression. These tendency for high anxiety and panic attacks. Non-competitive in sports or games. So it's interesting to sort of look at the symptoms, because Dr. Walsh over the 40 years basically found the correlations between patient after patient after patient. He can narrow down, and when we were there, a lot of times we would do a symptom questionnaire, and at the end of it, the patient would leave, and then he'd be like, okay, how many people think this person's undermethylated? Okay, how many think it's overmethylated? How many think low zinc? How many think low B6? How many think... He'd go through the whole thing and everybody would kind of guess. And then he'd pull up the blood work and you'd look at it and you were right about 90% of the time. He's dialed down the symptoms so well and they're so unique. So low folate depression, again, non-competitive as opposed to undermethylated, which are highly competitive. Absence of inhalant allergies. Food chemical sensitivities these people tend to suffer with more. These are the people that do horrible on SSRIs. And Dr. Walsh even said that he would venture to say that when you get these childhood shootings that have happened in the States, like Columbine, where a lot of these kids actually had been put on an SSRI prior, he said, I could guarantee you for a child that does that, they were probably overmethylated because what happens is then they gave them the medication that was the exact opposite of what their biochemistry needed, and they ended up with a massive overdose of serotonin, which then can create, that can also be related to things like schizophrenia and paranoia. So in his mind, before anybody would ever get put on an SSRI, they should be sure to check what their methylation status is to know if it's a drug for them or not. The child that I saw, that I was telling you about with the high pyrrols, his doctor wanted to start him on medications. And what we found was that he was actually also overmethylated and had high pyrrols. So he had a double whammy of 2 different things going on. So medication for anxiety like an SSRI would have been a very bad one for him to be on. These people tend to be your really musical and artistic people. And it's really funny because the more I've been testing people over the year and seeing this, you see it over and over again. It's like, oh my gosh. And you find out what the person is, they're like, oh yeah, I'm a painter, or whatever. And the other ones on the opposite side are usually more like there's good and bad traits with both of them. So it's not like being over-methylated is horrible or being under-methylated is horrible. They've actually got really great skills. If I checked myself, which I'm going to be running through all of these on me too, even though I don't necessarily suffer from anything particular, but I bet you I would lean towards being under-methylated. As they said when we were there, Dr. Walsh said, look around. He goes, probably 90% of the people that are here in this room are probably under-methylated. Because part of the under-methylated drive is there's a competitiveness and you want to do well and you kind of stay. And most of these people tend to stay in school for a long time and they kind of keep going and keep doing stuff, and it's a competitive sort of nature. So if it's done, if you utilize those well, then it can be beneficial. Same with over-methylated. Highly artistic and musical. That's a great attribute to have and huge creativity. But if it's too far, it becomes overwhelming. And it can actually lead to anxiety and depression. They tend towards more underachievement. These people have more sleep disorders and generally lower libido. Now, you don't have to be 100% of any of these. He said, I think, around 30 to 40% of those symptoms, if they fit for somebody, then it would be warrant to get them checked. High copper. More than 95% of high copper depression is in women. If copper has a tendency to fluctuate with estrogen levels. So if anybody has ever had postpartum depression, you can almost guarantee they're high copper. Almost all postpartum depression has elevated copper levels. Copper naturally rises, almost doubles during pregnancy. And then after, we should be able to get rid of it, because copper is essential for a lot of neural development in the baby. But after the baby's been delivered, then your copper should naturally come back down. But if you have an epigenetic imbalance that doesn't allow you to get rid of copper, then you tend to get all of the symptoms from high copper, which I will explain in just a bit. The 95% female. Inability to eliminate excess copper, and they tend towards high anxiety. Tendency for postpartum depression, onset during hormonal events. So think of this with menarche. So when you first get your period, when you very first had your period, if you have bad PMS, if you have symptoms around postpartum, and if you have bad menopause. If those things play in, you tend to have high copper and be worthy of getting it checked out. Often plays in with estrogen imbalances. You can also tend towards getting ringing in the ears. I've seen that in a couple of people that have had exceptionally high copper, and they've also come in actually for tinnitus, which is that ringing in the ears. And they also tend to have more sensitive skin and intolerance to cheap metals, stuff like that. Sometimes even things like skin tags, or tags on the back of a shirt that just kind of like bug people the wrong way, stuff like that. And they tend to have meltdowns, and they can have a really quick flip-flop between being okay and then totally not okay. Pyrrol disorder. Severe mood swings. This is the one with that child that I was talking about. Very, very poor stress control. So everything could be okay, and then the moment something happens where the environment changes, something happens sort of that wasn't planned, they have no ability to cope with that. Change by nature is stressful to people. It triggers that part of the nervous system that puts us in high awareness. It triggers that fight or flight. If they have elevated pyrrols, then they don't have the biochemistry to manage that type of a situation very effectively. Extreme anxiety, poor short-term memory, can have reading disorders, little or no dream recall. Sensitivity to light and to noise. Does anybody know anybody like that? I see this with a lot of kids too that are diagnosed with ADHD, and this will come up when we do our talk on ADHD as well. Because it pulls out a lot of B6 and zinc, zinc is needed for tons of different things in the body, immune system being one of them. So they also tend to have poor immune function. So you see chronic colds, or easy to get viruses, or ear infections, or something along those lines too, that can happen. Very poor morning appetite. That's a very characteristic symptom of high pyrrols. When people wake up, if they are dealing with anxiety or depression, and they could care less if they eat in the morning, that also is a symptom of elevated pyrrols. Abnormal fat distribution and inability to tan. Their skin is usually very sensitive and light sensitive too. So they also tend to be sensitive to getting burns easier too. Toxic metal depression, a little bit different. This one doesn't come up as often, but sometimes I will check it if the person has really high copper, then they might lose the ability to pull out other types of metals too. Because there's certain compounds that we have to create in the body to remove this kind of stuff. So this is the absence of any trauma or emotional triggers. Abdominal distress, so a lot of times it might be bugging their intestinal tract as well. Unrelenting depression no matter what they've done. You can see cognitive deficits in children. Sometimes you might have bad breath or metallic, metally tasting sensation in the mouth. Lots of irritability, anger, and you'll see other things like food sensitivity. So a lot of times you can have different reactions or intolerances to a number of different foods. And because metals cause you to bind up a lot of your natural antioxidants, you end up with a lot of oxidative stress. And they themselves often act like what's called a free radical, which damages cell after cell after cell. So, when we look at how do nutrients affect neurotransmitters? So, we know that they affect the production of neurotransmitters. So, if we don't have enough of the right nutrients, they're used in producing neurotransmitters, so we need to have more of them if we're going to try and produce them. We can also have an imbalance where you can cause an increase in the conversion of one neurotransmitter to another, which we'll talk about in the respect to copper. And they can increase or decrease the production on something called a transporter protein that leads to either too much or too little neurotransmitter available in that synapse where you need to have all of it functioning. And that's more of an epigenetic mechanism that happens with the methylation stuff. So let's take a look at the synthesis of these different things. When we are making serotonin, there's all these little precursors you have to have. So first off, you have to make sure digestion is working fairly well, because if we're not breaking down proteins effectively, we can't get the amino acids that we need, right? So we need to have amino acids like tryptophan originally to start this whole cascade off. So you have to make sure digestion is working well, and we try to fine-tune diet a little bit. But what ultimately is going to convert tryptophan to 5-hydroxytryptophan, eventually to make this is what you want, you have to have B6 and zinc. Those are the catalysts for this enzyme that converts it. If you don't have enough B6 or zinc, you cannot convert it over to serotonin. So it's like that's the stop right there. If you are deficient in B6 and zinc, you will not be able to make enough serotonin for what your body requires. And this is also exactly the same thing for dopamine synthesis. This enzyme, called this L-amino acid decarboxylase, is completely dependent on B6 primarily and zinc secondarily, because zinc actually makes B6 usable. It turns it into its active form. So again, if you don't have enough of those, then you can't make enough dopamine. Same thing with GABA. Same idea. You need B6 and zinc. If you don't have enough of it, then you can't make that last step and actually make enough of the neurotransmitter. So when you think about these people that have elevated pyrrols, for example, that have very low levels of zinc and B6, it's just wreaking havoc on all of these different neurotransmitters. So when we look at B6, B6 is very, very commonly deficient in people. Unfortunately, there's a lot of different nutrients that I think people are getting lower and lower amounts in. And part of that has to do with how effective your diet is, what we actually eat, how our digestion's working if we're breaking it down and assimilating it properly. And then the other problem with a lot of the nutrition, especially the elements, especially the minerals, that has to be in the soil. So if you have soil that's depleted of minerals, the plant is not magically going to make a whole lot more, right? So iron's supposed to be high, or spinach is supposed to be high in iron. If you have soil that's depleted in iron, you're probably not going to make a whole lot of iron in that spinach when you're having it. And they've kind of found that over the last several decades, the nutrition in our food is completely different than what it is now. So A lot of people, so that's part of it. And the other part is that when stress is high, when we live a hectic lifestyle, our requirement for a lot of these different nutrients is exponential. So, for example, another nutrient, something like, well, let's look at zinc, or vitamin C. If we have got a virus, say we got a common cold, our requirements for vitamin C just skyrockets, because that's the primary nutrient that helps the white blood cells actually kill off and sequester different bugs and sort of kill them off. If we don't have enough, then we can't do that job effectively. This tends to happen with a lot of these ones that play with brain chemistry. So you don't have to worry about all the specifics on here, but for the most part, B6, essential for the production of serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. If we don't have enough of it, it is inevitable that we will not be able to create enough of the neurotransmitter that helps us deal with life. When we supplement with this, when people need it, they're usually doing it in the form of B6 and in an active form of B6 called pyridoxal 5-phosphate, or P5P we call it. And again, when people are also under inflammation, so if you're eating foods that your body doesn't agree with, if you're burning the candle at both ends, if you've got musculoskeletal aches and pains, if we've got all the stuff that creates inflammation, if our fatty acid ratios are totally out of balance, that also tends to use up a lot of B6. So depending on where the individual is, we have to look at all those factors, but those are all partly reasons why we might not be able to hang on to it. And B6 deficiency has been related to a number of different conditions, including depression, anxiety, ADHD, sleep disorders, and irritability and anger. And there's a wide myriad of mental, emotional, behavioral problems due to the wide array of neurotransmitters that are affected. So you could have a whole lot of different symptoms because it's affecting so many different neurotransmitters. When we look at zinc, same sort of thing. It's one of the most common, if not the most common nutrient deficiency in the world at this point. And it's involved in 200 plus different enzymes in the body. So when you're deficient in it, how it might show up in the body might be in how you're feeling, how you think. So it might show up more from a mental health perspective. You might be having more anxiety and poor stress tolerance. But because it is involved in so many different enzymes, you can also see things like poor immune function, poor growth, delayed sexual development. You can be sick a lot of the time and your immune system can kind of be in the hole. So you can see it in a lot of different places, but it more or less is involved in the same neurotransmitters that B6 is, serotonin, GABA, and dopamine. When I check levels on this, you should see healthy levels at about 90 to 130 micrograms per deciliter. And what they found is that the mean for patients with any kind of mental health concerns is around 76. And I can say I have seen that across the board. And I've seen them down as low as in the low 50s. So for that person, they need double the amount of zinc to actually balance these things off. Copper's a really interesting one. And I see this one a lot, mostly in women. I see it in men sometimes too, but I definitely see this one in women more because there's a relationship with estrogen that plays into this. So one of the primary catalysts to convert dopamine into adrenaline. Okay, so we can make all these things individually, but then they also, certain ones like dopamine is in the pathway where it eventually gets converted to adrenaline. So what happens is that if we have too much free copper, it shunts the reaction in this direction. So what's essentially happening is that you are causing a depletion in dopamine levels and you're causing an increase in being adrenalized. So I think of it like this. We start to lose our ability to pleasure seek, which is one of the main functions of dopamine. It makes us feel pleasure from things. It also is one of the main ones that help us be engaged and be able to focus. This is a big ADHD one. So you'll see a lot of times if I see children with, say, ADHD, it's not uncommon that this imbalance could be happening. It ends up causing them very low levels of dopamine, and at the same time, they've got very high levels of adrenaline. So that's the hyperactivity, kind of go, 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 sort of amped up sort of piece of things, but with no ability to kind of focus and sort of be grounded and be able to feel pleasure from different things. I also think it's why sometimes there's there can be such a drive towards things like video games and some of this stuff too, because it tries to give you so much more dopamine by doing stuff like that for people that are already so low in it. But this one I find happens a fair bit. And so for women to get that checked, I think is always a good idea. And this one also tends because when the dopamine's low and the adrenaline particularly is high, the flip-flop in sort of emotional meltdowns can happen too. And it can happen so fast. And what I find with this, and this is why I start with this one, I do a lot of work around things with mindfulness training and heart rate variability training and a lot of stuff around self-regulation and the mind, body, spirit, and they are all completely interrelated. But what I found across the board is that if there is someone with very high levels of copper or very high levels of pyrrols, think of it like this. If someone has high copper and they're causing them to have a whole bunch of adrenaline, and I wanted to get that person to engage in mindfulness training, it would be like me sitting down and drinking 6 or 7 cups of coffee and then trying to sit down and meditate. I might be trying as hard as I can, but I've got a biochemical push just causing me to feel like this inside. So in my mind, and I've talked to people where they've done that, and then what has happened after? And they said, that's what I felt like. And when I did mindfulness training or I did cognitive behavioral therapy, it really helped me kind of see my anxiety and be more aware of it and maybe even give some tools to manage it better. But ultimately, they still felt like this inside. So when this starts to happen, if it's playing into it, in my mind, it just dials that intensity down so that now when you do the cognitive behavior, when you do the mindfulness training, when you actually can sit to do meditation or mindfulness, now you can actually reap all the benefits of it. But before that, I just find it is so difficult for people that have these sort of conditions. You know, it's like a kid with ADHD, if they had high pyrrols, to tell them to sit down and be quiet and everything, like there's no ability to regulate, like none. So even if we do a lot of the training on it, if there's a biochemical piece to it, I feel like that has to be addressed on some level before the other stuff can really get all the benefits that they have to offer. Question? No. Okay. So copper overload. Many patients with mental illness have genetic tendency to elevate copper levels, to elevated copper levels. They actually have an inability to pull copper out, so it tends to rise up. Sometimes it can be from overexposure, so it's possible to look at copper piping, high copper foods, some of that stuff, but for the most part, I think the vast majority of it is more epigenetic, and they do not have there's specific antioxidants that pull copper out. Probably one of the main ones being called metallothionein, which actually requires a ton of zinc to even make. So if you're low in zinc and you've got high copper, you don't even have the building blocks to make what's going to help you get rid of copper. Common one I see a lot. For all the same reasons I just talked about, converting dopamine to adrenaline. And it's not expensive to get it tested. It's relatively easy to work with. It's definitely harder if someone is going through menopause or if they're on birth control pill or hormone replacement therapy. Anything along those lines will make it that much harder to try and bring copper down because it tends to raise copper. So some of the more symptoms from an overload, so severe anxiety, sleep disorders, hormonal imbalances, hyperactivity in childhood, skin sensitivity to metals and rough fabric, tinnitus or ringing in the ears, estrogen intolerance, postpartum depression, there could have been a history with some learning disabilities, white spots on the fingernails, emotional meltdowns and frequent anger and poor immune function. The white spots on the fingernails and poor immune function is often because with high copper almost always goes low zinc. And zinc will cause those white spots in the nails. Zinc is a primary nutrient for things like skin, hair, nails, all that kind of stuff. Elevated pyrrols. This is the double whammy where you end up with low B6 and low zinc. So what's a pyrrol? It's a funny name. It was figured out years back from some of the old original doctors that were psychiatrists, PhD, like Abram Hoffer, that did a lot of work in what was called orthomolecular nutrition. And originally it was called mauve disease, I think. And because the urine was actually a slightly different color for people that had exceptionally high levels of pyrrols. What a pyrrol is it is a byproduct of normal production of hemoglobin. So we're supposed to make pyrrols, and it actually lends iron to hemoglobin, and then we should be able to get rid of pyrrols. But the problem is that if people have an epigenetic tendency to have difficulty removing pyrrols, then it builds up. And then pyrrols have a very strong affinity for B6 and zinc. So they bind up this B6 and zinc, and then we pee it out. And so people with high pyrrols can have exceptionally low levels of zinc and B6. And we don't check B6 by itself because it's not a very accurate marker to check B6 levels. Pyrrols is a much more functional way of looking at really what's going on in the body and assessing levels of B6. So you are going to get a dramatic decrease in B6 and zinc, which is going to dramatically affect your production and the synthesis of serotonin, dopamine, and GABA. It also tends to create a lot of oxidative stress. So pyrrols also is an indicator for some functional med docs will look at pyrrols as being an indicator of oxidative stress. High pyrrols, then it means you have a lot of damage going on in the cellular tissue. So then we need to amp up our antioxidants as part of the treatment with high pyrrols as well as significantly bumping up levels of zinc and B6. Very poor stress control, fearfulness, anxiety, depression, hyperactivity. Lots of sensitivity, oversensitive. And this is really neat because when I look at Dr. Shanker's work around self-regulation, a lot of what he will talk about is you have to first figure out what is going on in that child's environment that is making them not able to regulate. What is tweaking their fight or flight nervous system? And that could be, I mean, you know, sometimes it's like as a parent, you're sitting there going, just sit down, like just sit down at the dinner table. But in that child's mind, maybe they're uncomfortable, maybe the seat's uncomfortable, maybe there's something with the lights that are shining in the room. There could be maybe too much noise in the background or not enough. All of these little things could be things that are throwing their fight or flight nervous system out of balance. When I think of it like this is an extremely functional biochemical perspective on what might be going on with those kids. And a lot of those kids I see elevated pyrrols. So when we can start to get the pyrrols down, allow them to make more neurotransmitter, then all of a sudden their world is not so touchy. They're able to kind of handle more, right? Just like anybody, if you had super low iron and you were completely tired and lethargic all the time and you're trying to work and you're trying to work out and you're trying to manage your kids and all of these types of things, it's very difficult to do when you've got such low iron. As soon as you get your iron back up into optimal zones, all of a sudden your energy is back up and your tolerance for things significantly changes. So it's the same idea. If there's certain things out of balance, get them back in balance and let the body do what it's designed to do best. And then work on all of the other pieces of it because they still need other pieces. If you're an adult and you've had imbalances like this for most of your life, you can guarantee that you're going to have certain patterns of thinking that coincide with the way you're feeling. That has to now be reworked. We have to find new strategies to kind of get that stuff turned around. But it's a lot easier to do it when you feel different inside. Sensitivity to loud noises and bright lights, severe inattention, poor muscle development, tendency to skip breakfast in the morning or morning nausea, white spots on the nails, little or no dream recall. That seems to be a big B6 function. If you have very poor dream recall, some people would actually say that that's almost diagnostic of low B6. Especially elevated during growth spurts. So you'll naturally see this in kids. Their pyrrole levels will go up a little bit more around the terrible twos and around teenage years, right? Because those are big transitions. So they naturally tend to have a little bit higher pyrroles because pyrroles go both ways. You can have an epigenetic reason that doesn't allow you to pull it out, but also stress tends to raise pyrrols a little bit. So for some people, if they have an epigenetic dysfunction where they can't get rid of it, and they're going through a growth spurt, watch out. Delayed growth, skin problems, obsession with negative thoughts, poor wound healing and frequent infections. This is the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, even more so than copper. This is the one where there's just from 0 to 60, mood can fluctuate like that. And you'll see this with a lot of times with, well, I say kids a lot of times just because I see this a lot with kids, but you'll see it with adults too. And this would be, picture probably wherever you're in your safer environment, because that's usually where most of our Dr. Jekyll parts come out. So think of like family, think of spouse, think of like parents, stuff like that. That's where the mood can kind of flip very quickly. Sometimes we hold it together a bit better in maybe like work environment or something like that, but it can switch very quickly. Kids, because they have less access to this prefrontal cortex. So you see it so dramatically in them because they don't have the ability to access this part of their brain as much. That really develops more between 18 and early 20s. So adults, we can sometimes try to make ourselves make better decisions in appropriate places, right? Or make more appropriate choices in different circumstances. But kids, because they don't access this part of the brain the same way, it comes out very authentically. You will see very quickly if there's stuff like this going on. It's like we were out for dinner just the other day, and the dad took the phone away from the child, and he had a complete meltdown. And in my head, I'm like, I'm sure that kid's got high pyrrols. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I totally want to see what his levels are like. Because it would also make the whole dynamic so much easier, right? Like if they're not tending to outburst as much, then they can manage things a bit better. It makes the parents better. Then the parents don't react to the child in the same way, and it goes back and forth, right? This could be equally to partners too. High pyrrols also have a tendency to stay up late, can be extremely irritable, short-term memory problems, and they tend to have aches and pains because there's a lot of oxidative stress that can go on. So high pyrrols, that's the double whammy, both zinc and B6 deficiency. When you look at fatty acids, what's interesting is most of the time when we look at mental health, it's usually omega-3s. It's like fish oils, and which are still very important for the vast majority of people with mental health. I would say go higher on omega-3s from fish oils, because that's often an imbalance. And when I check people for a fatty acid profile, I commonly see that people are out of balance with omega-3s. But when people have high pyrrols, they actually are not able to utilize the omega-6s, particularly evening primrose oil or borage oil, the GLAs. So usually these people actually need to not be on fish oil, they need to be put on a evening primrose or a borage oil to get their GLA up for the first little while. And they have to do lots of work around managing oxidative stress because there's a lot of damage that happens from that on a cellular level. And so what we target is raising levels of zinc and B6 and managing the oxidative stress, and then rechecking and looking to see how much everything has come back down. And pyrrols actually can be treated relatively effectively, and they're the fastest one to resolve. Pyrrols sometimes can be totally resolved within 6 weeks to 8 weeks if they're high. Copper tends to take longer, could be like, depending, 3 to 4 months. Sometimes I've seen it even longer before it gets totally normalized. And when you get into methylation issues, which we're going to talk about now, these are big underlying currents in our personality and who we are that have been there right from day one. And so when we look at methylation status, we're often looking at 8 months to a year of regularly working with until you get the full benefits of it. So methylation disorders. Without getting into tons of detail on what these are, we have all these different biochemical processes going on in our body all the time, billions of times per second, and methylation is one of these major ones. And basically the cells put methyl groups on, take them off, add them, move them. It just helps us convert things around and use different components in our body, different chemicals and whatnot, and we use it in detoxification, we use it in brain health, we use it in lots of different pieces of health. So I just want you to understand that we use it more than 1 billion times a second in every cell and every organ of our body. It's important. It needs to work properly. And there's certain systems that it tends to work or have a bigger influence on. So detoxification, hormones and inflammation, it's a big player in stuff like that. Energy production. And for us, what we're going to talk about today, it is a primary neurotransmitter synthesis and reuptake. It affects how we hang on to those neurotransmitters once we've put them into the synapse and are supposed to be able to utilize them. And it has an epigenetic influence on these transporter proteins, which I'll show you in a sec. So, big advances in brain disorders and brain health, methylation and epigenetics, and they really go kind of hand in hand. So epigenetics, like I said, how we live our life influences what genes we turn on and what genes we turn off. And ultimately that's because it's affecting methyl groups. Methyl groups tend to turn on or off. Mostly they downregulate. But they interact with each other. If we are in utero and we have been passed along from a few generations back certain epigenetic or certain methylation, they're called SNPs, these little sort of SNPs that go on DNA and proteins. If we have had certain of those sort of passed along from our ancestors, we have some susceptibilities. And then the more we understand that, then how we interact with our environment will either aggravate that or make it better. So what we are given is not written in stone. It's more like it's still back in our control for a lot of the part, but we just need to know how to work with it. So when we look at methylation, there's two different ones we look at, undermethylated or overmethylated. And the incidence in the general population. So 70% of the general population is normally methylated. If I look at their blood levels, they fall right in through here. And then there is a group, about 22%, that is undermethylated, below the normal level. And then you've got a small percent, about 8%, that is above that level. And what I want you to think about is when we look at what these methylation things do. So what these methyl groups do, they regulate gene expression. And the primary gene that they have an effect on is the gene that makes things called transporter proteins. So I want you to think when a synapse, which is basically where these two sort of nerves meet, and that's where all the stuff gets transported across and we have this desired effect. If you're undermethylated, you have basically epigenetically created way too many transporter proteins. Think of transport proteins like the little holes in the bucket. So every time you get a transporter protein, it creates a hole in the bucket and it drains out your neurotransmitters. So if we have turned that on, or I should say we've downregulated, and as a consequence we have created way too many holes in our bucket. So what that means is that we cannot keep enough serotonin in there. So even if we're making a lot of it, even if we've got enough nutrition and we're doing it, if you're undermethylated, the problem is that you could be making it and putting it in the bucket, but it never stays there. It keeps getting drained out way too fast. That's what happens when people are undermethylated. And so the problem for some people is that if they're both, if they had low B6 and zinc and they were undermethylated, they're not making enough, and the little bit that they get there can't even stay there. So they're in a big mess. And you treat them both very differently. If you're overmethylated, it's the opposite. You can't create enough transporter protein. So you've got no holes in your bucket, and you end up with way too much. And so this was the example on when we're talking about like columbine. And if that were the case, if someone was already overmethylated, they've got too much serotonin and dopamine. If that's the case, and then you give them an SSRI, which tries to plug up more holes in the bucket, you get way too much and then it overflows, and that creates a whole different array of problems. So when we look at the incidence of undermethylation, 98% of autistic spectrum undermethylated. Antisocial personality, he's found about 95%. This is all from Dr. Walsh's research over the past 40 years. 98% of the people that he saw with autism spectrum, undermethylated. 95% antisocial personality disorder. Of the schizophrenic patients, 90% of them were undermethylated. Oppositional defiance, about 85%. I see this one in a lot of kids with behavioral issues. Most of the kids, particularly the boys that I see that are oppositional defiant, because you look at the traits of being undermethylated, they're usually defiant. They are usually very strong-willed. They're the ones that put their foot in the ground. They're highly competitive. And I know this very first-handed with family in certain ways. And you can see the characteristics come out. And then when you start to treat it, you actually see this it's like the things that would normally, the defiance, like I would find the biggest one that I would find would be defiance. That would be the behavior that would come up with this particular 12-year-old that I know. Not the one that I was treating before. This is a different one, more personal. And so this one would have a tendency for very strong defiance. And and it was like, once it happens, like, oh, that's it, it's like game over. It doesn't matter what, and there's no communicating, everything's kind of shut down. Ability to self-regulate, completely gone. But it can happen very quickly. And so once I sort of tested everything and found out, okay, this person's undermethylated, so we start to treat them with it. What I've kind of found is that the tendencies are still there. It's a part of our personality trait. If we're undermethylated, we will have a tendency to be a little bit more competitive. We'll have a tendency to be a little bit more dig our feet in the ground. I think of it like zodiac signs, you know? It's like it's built into our DNA a little bit. And so, but there's got to be an excessive and exaggerated piece of it, but if you can get it into a good zone, then it's like we can use all those powers for good as opposed to evil. So I think of it like, if we can use competitiveness, we can use some of the defiance to be strong-willed, to get things done, to be proactive, to do all that, that's great. But once you start to treat it, you will find that it starts to move a little bit more in that zone. I saw a patient just the other day who had anxiety, depression, and major anger issues. And so for this range, the range for this, I'm trying to think, we have to check a test called a whole blood histamine test, which is a very good marker for overall methylation status. And this fellow was, and he had pretty much diagnosed himself. He figured, he had read Dr. Walsh's book, and he came in to see me. He's like, I'm pretty sure I'm undermethylated. And he had done like several rounds of Vipassana meditation. He had done Jungian psychology for about 10 years. He'd worked with a lot of stuff and it helped, but he still found that stuff would happen at work and it would just be like game over. He just couldn't control it. And when he started treating it, so we got his blood work back, and the overmethylation is anything over 7. Undermethylation is anything over 70. So undermethylated means high histamine. They're an inverse relationship. So anyways, that part you don't need to know. But what was interesting was anything above 70, and the cutoff was up around 120. His came back at 156 or something like that. Like he was like, had a feeling I was undermethylated, but I was really surprised when I saw that. And he'd been treating it, and he found that his work environment has just changed. He goes, honestly, it just feels like the dial's been brought down a little bit. And my reactivity is different. It's still there, but it's so much more manageable. And that's the best way I can describe it, is I think when things get optimized biochemically, you've just got the building blocks to make the body work better. And then he was also open to doing a lot of the other work to kind of change some of the patterns. And he's done a lot of insightful work as well. Overmethylation, panic and anxiety attacks, 64%. Paranoid schizophrenia, 52%. This is what he was thinking was even possible with some of those childhood shootings, is that when they were put on an SSRI and they're overmethylated, that it puts them into almost a paranoid schizophrenic state. ADHD about 28%, behavior disorders 23%, and depression 18%. So again, some of the symptoms for undermethylated: very strong-willed, oppositional to authority, seasonal inhalant allergies, competitive in sports or games, calm demeanor on the inside but high inner tension. High fluidity, they also tends to have they're more teary, they produce more saliva. This is just another tendency that happens because methylation plays into hundreds and hundreds of different reactions in the body. Tendency towards OCD tendencies and controlling behavior. These people do generally fairly well with an SSRI, and they tend to have a higher libido. Whereas the overmethylated, high anxiety and panic tendency, hyperactivity, nervous legs, pacing, sleep disorders, lower libido, absence of seasonal allergies, more prone to chemical sensitivities and food sensitivities, dry eyes and mouth, excellent socialization and empathic. They're very creative people. They're usually more involved in things in the arts, non-competitive, an adverse reaction to SSRIs and antihistamines. So how we look at this is to really figure out what's going on. It's a combination of looking at an intake and brain chemistry questionnaire where we really try and dial down a lot of key symptoms that fit into the different categories, and then looking at some of the specifics around the blood and urine test. So there's a urine test we look at through a lab in the States that checks pyrrols, and then we run some of the tests from here through a lab called gamma Dynacare where we can look at copper, zinc levels, and overall methylation status. Once we get all those pieces together, then we can look to see specifically what's going on for you as an individual, and then it's very, it's very straightforward as far as what is needed and reproducible to bring levels back down again if they're high. So Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, who was one of the pioneers in orthomolecular medicine, he said, for every drug that benefits a patient, there are natural substances that can produce the same effect. And this is a lot of his pioneering research into this area. And a lot of these guys that did most of this work originally for orthomolecular, looking at nutrients and playing into health, were all psychiatrists. They were all psychiatrists, PhD researchers that just wanted to find another way to work with things. So that concludes what I was going to talk about for advanced nutrient therapy. If you want to get a hold of me, feel free to email me or go to my website. You can touch base. I think if you're interested in this kind of stuff too, check out the walshinstitute.org or just Google Walsh Research Institute. You'll get a bunch of different information from there. It's really amazing. And thanks so much for coming. And if anybody has any questions, chat with me now. Yeah?
What are some foods that have more B6 or zinc, if that's the...
Yeah. The thing is that when you're looking at having a big imbalance, you'll never get enough B6 from foods to supplement for an imbalance because you've got an epigenetic pull causing the deficiency. So even if you're trying to have it in, and for the most part, the foods that are highest in B6 would be things like wild tuna, which you don't want to eat too much anyways because you might get too much mercury. And grass-fed beef and organ meats are very high in it. Spinach is generally fairly good in it. Chicken can be high in it. But it totally depends, again, on what's the nutrition going into the animal. So part of the problem is it's just not the same that it used to be. So if you went to a organic farmer and you knew that they weren't spraying glyphosate on their crops and doing all this stuff, you're going to be much better off. But you have to remember, most of these are not diet related, they're epigenetic. There is susceptibility that has been passed along that is not allowing people to either get rid of copper or that's causing them to deplete too much zinc or B6, or they have an epigenetic methylation imbalance which will not change. So for methylation particularly, Dr. Walsh would say that is the susceptibility. So when you know it, you don't even retest to look to see if numbers are going down for that. You know that that's their susceptibility, and then that needs to be managed.
And as far as these tests go, do you need to be tested when you're in a particularly sort of high state of anxiety, or if you suffer from anxiety and you have these tests done, if you feel pretty chilled out, it will still show? what the issue was?
Yeah. If there's an imbalance there, then that will still show up. So for example, your methylation status is your methylation status. If you're undermethylated or over or normal, that will show up, and then that's kind of what we'll go by. For high copper, for the most part, it would be exacerbated if you were going through hormonal changes. So if you were going through like postpartum depression, I wouldn't even test it initially because it would probably be way too elevated anyways. Or menopause or something like that, it will exacerbate it. But no, it's not dependent on if you are having a outburst sort of thing, or if you're having a total meltdown around something, that now go get your blood test. Not necessarily. You might see slightly higher pyrrols if you're under an exorbitant amount of stress. That might raise the pyrrols a little bit. But generally, if you have an epigenetic imbalance that's causing you to have high pyrrols and low zinc and B6, it will show up. If it's there. I've checked, most people I have checked, I think there's maybe been one person I've checked where I checked all their panels and nothing really showed up for them, which just tells me it's not biochemical. It means they need to do much more, they need to primarily focus on now either gut biome and nutrition, self-regulation, mind-body connection. Like that's where they need to kind of work with more, because it's not a particularly biochemical thing. And when I say that, it's all of them, but it just depends on, I never know which amount is playing primary. So in my mind, when I see someone, I'm working with anybody, I'm thinking on all of these things, but I need to sort of find out, is this an actual thing that we need to work with? Because if it is, I feel like it's a rate limiting step on getting the full results.
Similar question, if a person's already taking like a psychotropic medication, so Prozac or something, does that affect
Yes.
your ability to accurately screen?
Yeah, if you're on certain medications, and there's a list of different ones that can affect the specificity of how accurate that's going to be, most of them will deplete the levels. So I'd have to look at some of the lists, but it depends. Like even like a strong antihistamine. If you are on a really strong antihistamine, that'll affect the methylation status because we're looking at a whole blood histamine, right? So, but a lot of the other ones, some of the other psychotropic are the depressant meds, and some of those ones, and some of the psychotic meds and stuff can absolutely affect some of those things. So knowing what people are on, technically they would need to be off it for about 12 to 24 hours, but sometimes you just can't do that with certain people. But generally they would say be off of all supplements and medications for 12 to 24 hours to get the most accurate look. Now sometimes depending on what cocktail people, I've had some patients that are on a lot of different things, and I don't even bother. I more look at their symptoms, because a lot of times at that point it's like, you know what, I don't think I'm going to trust the labs that I'm going to get, or I might say I'm not going to run these ones, but maybe we'll check this one because that one won't be affected based on the medications. And then I really more look at the symptoms around it. I for example, had a fellow a while back who I have seen since I've seen him for a while. His early 20s. He's on that autistic spectrum, but he's in his early 20s. He's also got a tendency for strong violence, and he won't get his blood tested. So, and I don't blame anybody, probably wouldn't want to try and take his blood. So I checked his pyrrols, because my feeling is that I think he's probably got exceptionally high levels of copper, because that's a tendency for aggressive behavior that can tend to happen at times. And when I checked his pyrrols, he was just elevated. He was elevated, but I was expecting it to be like really high, but because of the medications, it was totally keeping it down, but it still showed up to be elevated. So when I take that, based with his symptoms, I'm able to start to treat him. I just might not treat the full treatment. I might start a little bit lower and sort of look for how he's doing as I'm moving into it. And so far he's been done really well so far with it. So we'll just kind of steadily watch his symptoms on that. Yeah, but good question. Okay.
So I'm a type 1 diabetic. I'm an anomaly to every doctor I've seen in the last 25 years. Most of people suffer from depression. Can you help?
Well, it would be the same things. It's like, Like I said, there's multiple pieces to it. Like there is with all problems. There's always the more I've been in healthcare, the more I see there is just always there's a biochemical, a mental, emotional, a spiritual, a belief structure stuff that needs to be, like it's all amalgamated into one big thing. This piece of it though, if it's playing into it, absolutely. Blood sugar imbalances is also a big one that will tweak a whole slew of different problems. A lot of the original orthomolecular docs would say, number one, balance out dysglycemia. So if your blood sugar is doing this, get it going like this better, because so part of it would be doing that, and that would mean for you would need to we'd have to fine-tune the right kind of diet that would do that better along with your medication and everything. And you'd probably need other support for blood sugar. But that would be a piece of it, and then this would still be a separate piece. It's almost like that would be a big part that I would want to make sure we got balanced, because that affects a lot of stuff. But at the same point, if this is going on, it's just another part. Yeah.
So the average person who is not into organic food from different reasons should take supplement of B6 and zinc?
No, because if you don't need B6 or zinc, then too much B6 or zinc can actually be neurodestructive. It can actually damage nerve cells.
You know?
You test. So a low level of B6 is not going to be a problem. What I'm talking about if I check someone and they have elevated pyrrols, their requirements are significantly higher than what the average person would need.
Okay.
So for example, B6. You might take a B50, and get 50 milligrams of B6. If someone has exceptionally elevated pyrrols, they may need 300 milligrams a day of B6, which for a person that does not need it would be problematic and probably create even possible problems to the nerves. So in that reason, you don't treat yourself, you try and figure out exactly what's going on, and it's why there's a combination of symptoms and blood work, because ultimately you want to know specifically, do you need it or not? I get so many people that come in that are taking, a dozen different things, and yeah, they all sound good and they all make sense on some level, but you have to try and tailor it down to what do you mostly need right now, what's going to be the biggest players and the biggest bang for your buck that you mostly need, even though maybe all these things could be beneficial. Yeah.
What about lifestyle choices like sleep, exercise, alcohol?
Yeah, that would all for me fall into either the nutrition, gut health, and the mind-body aspect of things. Those are all play into it. But like I said, they're all interrelated. What I'll have to do on that too is have them like this, and then have them all with arrows meeting everybody. Because think of it this way: if you had elevated copper, well, you're not going to be able to sleep very well, right? Because you're adrenalized all the time and it's affecting your sleep. Or if you had pyrrols and you can't create enough GABA to calm your nervous system down before bed, and you get caught up with a ton of mental chatter, right? So if that's going on, then now you're getting two things. You're going to your first, you've got an imbalance biochemically that's affecting sleep, and now you're going to get all of the down-regulating problems from not having enough sleep.
Right.
Your energy is going to be low. You're probably going to start to tax your adrenals. All these other things are going to go on.
Right. So by themselves, they're neutral for B6, zinc, and copper.
Yeah, you need them if you need them. If you don't, there's not really a need to. Like, I wouldn't take stuff if I don't need it. I want to fine-tune and take things that I think I need so that I'm supporting myself, because too much or too little of anything is not good. So nutrients are just the same. It's just that you've got a bigger dose that you can handle. So like medications, if you took too much of a medication, it could be, it could be devastating. But if you took not enough, you'd get no effects on it. Same thing happens with nutrients. Like there's teeter-totters for everything. So, too much copper, not enough zinc, a problem. But too much zinc, not enough copper, that could be a problem too. It's just not very common. Anybody else?
Very interesting.
All right, well, that's great. Thank you so much. That's a fun one. Yeah, it's a fun topic. I really like talking about